The text I'm going to discuss with you today, or right now, I should say, is A.J. Ayer's Language, Truth, and Logic, and it's going to be a representative text from a philosophic movement of the present century known as logical positivism. Logical positivism has been far and away one of the most important and influential movements of the 20th century. In recent years, it's fallen under quite a bit of criticism, some of it quite fair, I would argue, but I think all too often such critics fail to see the logical positivists in their historical context, which is to say, they fail to recognize the sorts of problems and issues and phenomena that the logical positivists were reacting to. Specifically, I think there were two very important such phenomena in the environment which fundamentally determined the form of logical positivism and the direction it took. The first phenomenon was the profusion of speculative metaphysical systems in the post-Kantian epoch. For the positivists, they sensed, and I think quite accurately so, that such speculative metaphysical systems, which were pre- and super-scientific, i.e. prior to science, were very quickly turning philosophy into a laughingstock. In a period in which Einstein was doing his important researches, when a philosopher stood up and said, the world is nothing but will and idea, or it's nothing but der Geist coming to self-consciousness, there was a real danger of philosophy being laughed out of the academy and taking on a sort of irresponsible speculative flight of imaginative fancy. And I think the positivists very much wanted to preserve philosophy and bring it forward into a new scientific age of the 20th century. And that, I think, explains the positivistic part of their philosophy. And by positivism, we basically mean pro-science. The other important movement, or phenomena, that I think affected logical positivism was the culmination of an absolutely breathtaking revolution in symbolic logic that had actually begun in the 19th century with the researches of Cantor, I think really gained momentum with Boole's propositional calculus or truth functional calculus truth tables, and then really took off with Frege, and finally the foundational mathematical researches of Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead in Principia Mathematica. I want very briefly to tell you some of what that logical movement, revolution in logic, was about. Logic had remained fairly constant since Aristotle's time. The syllogism had been, until the mid-19th century at least until Frege's Begriffsschrift, or propositional calculus, had been the most sophisticated rule for inference. With Boole, however, and Frege, they began to get, or logicians began to have the aspiration that they could finally take logic and give it the same sort of rigor, precision, and formulaic, syntactic, ruled derivative basis that one finds in, say, arithmetic or mathematics. Needless to say, the revolution was extremely rich in results, such that by the turn of the century, that project had been turned on its head, in the sense that they had developed a complete artificial language of symbolic first-order logic called sentential logic, and second-order logic called predicate logic, which encapsulated in a purely formulaic way all of the rules of inference, and then once posited, with only two functions, all you have to know is how to use the word not and the word and. They could derive all of logic from it, provably, and then could prove that those systems were both consistent and complete. Consistency means that everything that is provable in the language is true. Completeness means that everything which is true in the language can be proven. And both of those claims were proven, in fact. So you had a completely, absolutely stunning breakthrough. And so very quickly they came to the view, hey, we don't have to mathematize logic, we have to logicize mathematics. Logic was already far more precise than mathematics had ever been. Now, we all know the practical consequences of this revolution in logic, the computer. But there was higher aspirations than that. In Principia Mathematica, Russell and Whitehead attempted to, simply by building up recursively, first-order logic, then describe, define, and build all of mathematics from that. In other words, turn all of mathematics into a derivation of pure logic, as a computer could do. And in fact, they had no small degree of success. It really emboldened the movement. I can't get into the details, but basically what they did is were able to define a successor operation, what we call counting. Then if you think about it, addition will turn out to be iterated successor. Multiplication will be iterated addition. Exponential functions will be iterated multiplication. Then subtraction, division, and roots will all be the inversion of those logically recursive functions. So there's this incredible sense of the power that logic was bestowing on modern thought, and hence the term logical positivism, the sense that there really was a fundamental breakthrough going on. And I should point out that such logicians were also philosophers and metamathematicians. Now, Ayer's text, the text we're going to be doing here, is a logical positivist manifesto, a manifesto of the doctrines shared by the famed Vienna Circle, whose head was Moritz Schlick, and whose philosophical lineage was traced, at least by Ayer, to Berkeley and Hume. And undoubtedly you've heard some of the famous names associated with the Vienna Circle: Ludwig Wittgenstein, Rudolf Carnap, Otto Neurath. So this is the first English language manifesto, and he wrote it at a young age, and as he said, it is very much a young man's book, and it's full of bluff and bluster and wild claims and a lot of pugnacity. It's actually a lot of fun to read. And you can tell anytime you get a book with this sort of graphic in the front, it's really deep. It's a very powerful text, and its form of presentation is not just pugnacious, but is a frontal assault on the entire tradition that precedes it. So in my presentation of this work, I want to try and represent that quality rather than just a straightforward rational reconstruction of the text, though I undoubtedly will hopefully be able to give you all of the important doctrines. Ayer begins the text with a chapter entitled The Elimination of Metaphysics. Now, Ayer achieves this goal, or in his own mind does, that is to say, the elimination of metaphysics, by analyzing the form of metaphysical sentences and demonstrating that they violate the criterion for literal significance, and are thus literally nonsense. Now, what is the criterion? Well, the argument runs something like this. The basic point he's going to try to establish is that metaphysical sentences fail to express propositions, and propositions are the only bearers of truth values in a propositional calculus. And such propositions are either factual or synthetic, or on the other hand, they're tautological, or also known as analytic. Here's the demonstration. Metaphysical sentences claim to give us extra scientific knowledge of the world. If that's so, they must fulfill the criteria of verifiability for factual statements. Right? That's how we know when a purportedly factual statement has meaning. It can pass the criteria of verifiability. And what it means is, in short, something to the effect of this. Given any sentence, would any observation be relevant to the determination of the sentence's truth or falsehood? Right? Is there any possible observation we can think of that would determine whether a particular sentence, factual sentence, is true or false? So if I say, well, this watch is made of black plastic, there are presumably observations that would count as confirming or disconfirming such a sentence. If I, on the other hand, were to say that there is a possible fat bald man in the corner over there, not actual, but a possible one, is there any experience which could possibly confirm or disconfirm? If not, then it is a literally meaningless statement as a factual statement. Well, we can formalize this expression because it'll turn out that very often factual statements will require inference to be able to be turned into an observationally relevant statement. So for any sentence, if it claims to be a factual proposition, it will express a factual proposition if and only if there exists a set of premises, we can call them Y, and an experiential proposition Z, such that that proposition and those other set Y entail Z, and Y does not. So, we could take, for instance, as Y in our case, that set of sentences, the various gravitational laws Newton advances. And we could take as our purported factual statement that if I release this, it will reach the ground in a certain amount of time. If we put those two together, I release this, and the laws that Newton gives us for gravitation, we should be able from that to deduce, would entail another proposition, that it will fall in however many seconds that the formulas would result in. And we can literally test it. So factual propositions, therefore, are really empirical hypotheses, which provide a rule for prediction of experience. Right? That's what we want out of a factual proposition. What can we expect in the future given certain initial conditions? Now this, of course, is not strong verification. It's something Ayer calls weak verification, which is to say it doesn't actually have to prove the experiential proposition. Just in some way, it should at least confirm or disconfirm its truth. But he asks, even with that weak criteria, which is enough for meaningfulness for factual propositions, what experience could possibly bear on the sentence, "The sensible world is merely a realm of appearance"? Is there any possible experience you could imagine that would confirm or disconfirm that? So then, what exactly does it express? Nothing at all. It's the verbal equivalent of going, blah, 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 right? Has no sense at all. It is literally nonsense. Similarly, take the famous dispute between monism and pluralism. The world is really one substance. No, the world is really many substance. What factually should we expect to hang on that? Would our physics change if it was monism or pluralism? Would our common sense change? Not at all. Nothing would change one way or the other. So literally, it's just noise. It says nothing whatsoever, nothing about the world. That is to say, metaphysical sentences are linguistic expressions without cognitive content. They're neither true or false. They're literal nonsense. And we can define a metaphysical sentence as follows. Any sentence is metaphysical if and only if it purports to express a proposition and is neither a tautology or an empirical hypothesis. Ayer then says, or rather attempts, to explain how metaphysics ever arose in the first place. And it turns out it's a superstitious view of grammar. Which is to say, take for instance the famed metaphysical term substance, right? Things are substances and they have accidents. Substance arises from the grammatical form of subject and predicate. Right? In both English and Greek, we find that every noun, right, presumably corresponds to an entity that is prior to its sensible properties, what Aristotle called its accidents. But in an analysis, which is to say a retranslation of such a sentence into purely logical syntax, reveals that a thing is defined as the sum of its properties. Properties don't hang on a thing, they hang on each other. There is not some Professor Staloff, which is prior to all of his noises, the colors that he wears, the various textures of his skin, that they don't hang on Professor Staloff. Professor Staloff is literally the sum of those phenomena. There's nothing more to him than that. Right? Therefore, what we have with substance, the notion of substance, is a misconceived superstitious interpretation of grammar. Being arises in a very similar fashion. In both English and classical Greek, the attributive or predicative form of sentences has the exact same grammatical structure as existential ones. So, for example, take the sentence, peas exist and peas are green. They have the same grammatical form. And that leads us to think that somehow existence is a property, like being green. Or we could take another example. Martyrs exist, and martyrs suffer. And that deceives us into thinking that somehow suffering and existence are both properties. But as Kant pointed out, existence is not a property. It's not an attribute, right? It's a claim about a sentence. Grammatical confusion leads then to what we might call an ontological slum, right? Simply because we treat every noun as actually referring to an entity, we wind up creating an incredibly clustered universe of all of the possible nouns we can imagine. Take, for example, the sentence, unicorns are fictitious. Right? Our typical metaphysician turns to us and says, well, unicorns must exist in some sense. Otherwise, we couldn't say they were fictitious. We couldn't attribute the property of fictitiousness to unicorns if unicorns didn't exist in some sense. So there must be possible unicorns, or unicorn ideas. Well, but fictitious is not a predicate, it's not a property, but it's a denial of existence. Thus, if you were to translate that sentence into a term which eliminated the phrase, you would not say, for any x, there exists some x such that x is a unicorn and x is fictitious. Rather, you would translate it as, for any x, x is not a unicorn. All right? Okay. And the problem here is that some metaphysicians, all metaphysicians, assume that every grammatical subject must refer. And since such entities don't fit into our world, like we've never come across the unicorn, we create another world somewhere out there where we can stick the unicorns. So maybe it's up in Plato's heaven, right? Or maybe it's in the possible world where the possible bald fat men live. And he says, of course, that's a confusion based on grammar. You're treating grammar as having some sort of ontological significance. Well, having eliminated metaphysics, we can turn to what philosophy should be. Real philosophy, its function, is critical rather than speculative. That is to say, philosophy is not a science, and thus can offer no knowledge of the world. That was the reason that metaphysics had to go. Philosophy's proper task is to analyze various problems and issues and clarify our linguistic usages. An example might be made of the problem of induction. I will remember this from Hume. Ayer proves, first, that there is no possible solution to the problem of induction. First of all, we begin like this. You can only deduce the principle of induction from either an empirical or an analytic proposition or principle. So it's either got to be empirical, factual, or analytic, logical. If it's analytic or formal, then you are guilty of deducing an existential proposition from a tautology, which is logically impossible. If, on the other hand, you try to deduce it from an empirical proposition, you assume the problem in question, which is to say, you're assuming the uniformity of nature, which is exactly what we're asking about when we turn to induction. Which, of course, presupposes that, in some sense, the future will resemble the present and the past, and therefore we can legitimately induce. Therefore, it is impossible to deduce the principle of induction, which is that the future will resemble the present. What Ayer does with this, and by the way, this should not be news to you, this is exactly what Hume said. Ayer points out, therefore, it's not a real problem at all. It's a pseudo-problem. Every real problem is capable of a solution. If you come across a problem which never can be solved in principle, it's a pseudo-problem. You're asking for proof in a place which is entirely inappropriate. Induction's validity is not and cannot and need not be proven. It's based simply on its results. We try it, and it turns out to be useful for us in our everyday and scientific beliefs. Ayer wants to argue that much of Western philosophy has in fact been analytic, has in fact been critical. He's very desirous to create a lineage. Locke on the theory of knowledge, Berkeley on phenomenology or defining things in terms of sense contents, and Hume, more so than any thinker, on causality and epistemology. But he points out that lesser analysts include Hobbes, Bentham, Mill, Plato, Aristotle, and even Kant, among others, in his better moments. They all use the same method, i.e. analysis, breaking things down into the smallest parts and rationally, logically reconstructing them. In doing this, the philosopher is not telling us about the world. What he's telling us about is the way we speak of things, the way we use our language, and not the things themselves. The philosopher speaks of language, not the world, by means of definitions. And such philosophy is, in fact, a department of logic. Now, the nature of philosophic analysis is to offer definitions for terms. Unlike the lexicographer writing a dictionary, the philosopher does not give explicit definitions, which are based on synonymy, but rather something Ayer calls definitions in use. What he means by that is that such a definition will translate a symbol into equivalent sentences which contain neither the symbol or any of its synonyms. For example, Berkeley tried to do this. He took sentences with material bodies and translated them into sentences about sense contents. Foundational mathematicians may well do this by redescribing number theory or elementary number theory in terms of set theory. So sentences which previously referred to numbers will now only refer to sets or classes. The best illustration, as far as Ayer is concerned, is Bertrand Russell's theory of definite descriptions, which deals with sentences of the form the so-and-so and translates them into sentences without that expression. And I've in fact given you an example of this on the sheet, Ayer on definite descriptions. One of the classic cases is the sentence, "The present king of France is bald." A great metaphysical nightmare. Because the metaphysician looks at that and says, well, it's a meaningful sentence, right? It's not true, but it must refer to something. There is no present king of France, but it must refer to something, otherwise we couldn't make any sense out of the sentence. The present king of France is bald. What Russell did is he paraphrased that sentence through the use of logical syntax in such a way that you eliminate the seeming noun, the seeming phrase, and point out that it's actually just a definite, particular description. So we would rather render it as I have with number 2. There exists some person, X, that is a present king of France, is bald, and is unique. Once it's phrased that way, none of us have any reluctance to say that's just false. And the problem of the possible potential present bald king of France is eliminated. And I've also, for your own edification, offered the logical syntax. Thus, Russell's theory of definite descriptions shows us how to define such terms in use, what grammatical function they have, and helps us understand these sentences and their logical structure. Ayer claims that all literally meaningful sentences or statements express propositions, which are the sole bearers of truth values. Such propositions are either analytical or tautological, or they are synthetic/factual. Analytic propositions, which Kant called a priori, are raised for the empiricist by the problem of accounting for mathematics and logic. Mill had tried to argue as an empiricist that they, in fact, all the propositions of mathematics and logic are simply inductions. They're hypotheses, which might turn out to be true and might not, and we believe them on the basis of probabilities. Unfortunately for Mill, according to Ayer, the truths of logic and mathematics are not merely probable, but are in fact necessary. We always hold them to be true, not because they refer to things, but because of the conventional rules we have about the way to use them, and the way we express such propositions. So they're true in a purely formal sense. Thus, the truths of logic and mathematics are analytic, which is to say, tautologous. They're true because they're empty definitions. They're true by fiat. Hence we state, X is an analytic proposition if and only if its validity depends solely on the definitions of the symbols it contains. And there are some good examples of that. 2 + 2 = 4 is an analytic proposition, not because the big 2 in the sky added to the big plus in the sky with the big 2 in the sky with the big equal is a 4. No, it's simply because the term plus is defined as iterated successor, and 4 is identical in a definitional sense to 2 + 2. Similarly, the proposition P or not P, it is either raining or it is not raining right now outside, is true not because of some factual thing, but simply because of the way we use the word or. Okay, its true functional properties are such that that is an analytic or tautologous question, or proposition rather. It is either raining or it's not raining. That exhausts the possibilities. The point is that analytic propositions have no factual content and only tell us how we use symbols according to our semantic or syntactic conventions or rules. The other class of meaningful propositions are empirical hypotheses. Unlike tautologies, there can be no certain knowledge of such propositions. All of the statements of science are capable of revision. We test the validity of an empirical hypothesis by seeing whether it enables us to anticipate or predict experience. Therefore, we will accept, say, Einsteinian physics over Newtonian because it allows us to predict effectively certain subatomic phenomena, which Newtonian physics does not allow. Such successful prediction does not prove the truth of Einsteinian physics, it simply increases its probability. While a contrary result, an anomaly as it were, would not prove it to be false, but would simply diminish its probability. This criterion for scientific or synthetic propositions in general is also a scientific doctrine, which is to say, it is in turn not provable or grounded in reason, but is rational for the exact same reason that scientific propositions are rational, which is to say that it has worked so far, and it has allowed us to predict what sort of things we can expect from scientists. Thus, our grounds for synthetic or factual beliefs are purely pragmatic, and this is the one place that the logical positivists stop their cap to the pragmatists and say, when it comes to factual statements about the world, you're right, pragmatism is the bottom line there. So there is no absolute rationality by which we could build foolproof hypotheses about the world. In that sense, William James had something, although on the whole, I think the positivists felt he was a logical illiterate, and perhaps quite rightly so. Having delimited the range of literally significant sentences, and I attempted to graphically, perhaps rather ugly, representation of that on the sheet, you'll find that the ones that are literally meaningful are these first two categories here, the analytic, based on definitions, and the synthetic, based on observation. Ayer then turns to an analysis of the traditional philosophic fields of ethics and theology, which you'll see show up here. Ethical statements comprise one of four classes. All right, there are basically four types of ethical statements we find. The first class contains definitions of ethical terms, and such analytic propositions which define the words good, value, etc., are in fact legitimate ethical philosophy or ethical philosophy proper. The second class of ethical propositions, where we use normative terms, contains descriptions of moral phenomena and their causes. And these synthetic propositions are in fact what we call the social or human sciences. Right? And a large part of common sense moral discourse is just that. Discussions of, well, what produces the most wealth for the most number of people? That's a factual proposition, capable of verification. The third class are exhortations to virtue, right? Do the right thing. And these are not propositions at all, but they're commands or ejaculations to prompt behavior. I want you to do something, so I tell you, attend to my lecture. Listen carefully. Now, the fourth class are ethical judgments proper. Ayer argues that such statements express neither analytic nor synthetic propositions. That is to say, normative ethical terms are not reducible to factual terms, but are rather absolute or irreducible. And Ayer sets this up very nicely. He says, well, we must agree with the intuitionists. There is no provability or scientific basis to ethics. And then, of course, he turns on them and says, that's not, of course, because ethics is higher. It's because ethical judgments are literally pseudo-concepts and have no meaning whatsoever. The function of ethical judgment is emotive, insofar as such terms evince, rather than assert, our feelings. And I've attempted to put together a couple sentences, again on that sheet, which should give you some sense of that. If I can find it, I think the first sentence said something to the effect of, yes, here we go. Let us suppose that Der Geist comes down in this room right now and turns to me and says, Der Geist, Hegel, of course, it was wrong of me to belittle metaphysics. Ayer says, okay, let's analyze that proposition. What is the factual content of that proposition? It tells us one factual thing, that I have belittled metaphysics. As to the wrongness of it, Well, he says, that's like saying, I belittle metaphysics with an exclamation point after it. Right? There's no factual information you tell me by saying I was wrong to belittle metaphysics, aside from the fact, obviously, that I had belittled metaphysics. There's nothing more factual there except a statement of, better yet, not a statement, an evincing of your feeling that, oh, I don't like it when you do that. You really shouldn't belittle metaphysics. And that's a particular ethical judgment. Imagine the case of a universal ethical judgment, such as, it's wrong to belittle metaphysics. Well, Ayer says, what is the difference between that sentence and belittling metaphysics? There's no more factual information in the first, sentence number 3 on this sheet, than number 4. It is as if one wrote belittling metaphysics with an exclamation point. Belittling metaphysics. Shouldn't do it. And in fact, he says, if you think about the ethical judgments you give to children, that's more often than not the form you give them. You don't say, it's wrong to steal that. It's wrong to cheat on your exam. Very often you just say, cheating on your exam. Shame, 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 shame. And he says, well, it's not that those judgments aren't important in life. They just have no factual meaning to them or analytic meaning. They simply express your feeling about it. You don't like me cheating on my exam. But if I had a student and I was to say to him, cheating on your exam, shame on you, how dare you? The purpose of your exam is so that you can learn about the course. That's why you came to college. Ayer points out, what if he turns to you and says, no, no, no. The purpose I went to college was that I could get good grades and go to law school and make a lot of money. There's no answer to that. That is probably why I went to college, right? Fortunately, I have the trump. I give him the grade. I can stop him from cheating. But there's no factual basis for deciding between us. It's simply, what did you want? What did I want? So, therefore, whenever we have disputes about ultimate values, there's pseudo-disputes. They can't be settled. You want justice, I want freedom. You want more money, someone else wants more compassion. There's no deciding such issues. It's like less filling tastes great, whatever you want. There's no final deciding such issues. There are, however, real moral disputes, and such moral disputes are always about questions of fact. Right? So, the dispute of we agree, we need to get our economy on the road again, right, to get employment up. Then, if we all agree to that, we can have a real moral dispute. I can say, we should give a middle-class tax cut. And someone can say, no, we shouldn't. That will result in the sort of economic growth that we want. What will really do it will be a huge capital gains tax cut. I don't know which of those is correct, but that, for Ayer, would be a meaningful moral dispute, because it actually could be decided through experimentation. Well, given that critique of ethics, I think you can see that aesthetics is in very much the same boat. You tell me that Picasso's beautiful, someone else tells me, no, he's not. Picasso's ugly. Juan Gris, that's beautiful painting. You like Gris, he likes Picasso. Let's call the whole thing off, as it were. Okay, now Ayer turns to theology. Ayer proves, at least to his own satisfaction, that it's impossible to prove demonstratively that God exists. And that's a very nice sort of proof. So first of all, empirical propositions, or rather, the demonstration of God's existence, right, must be made on either empirical or a priori grounds. Now, empirical propositions are uncertain, so that they can't produce a demonstratively certain proof. We saw the same thing with induction. On the other hand, if we use a priori or purely analytic grounds, then we discover that we're certain but tautologists. And from a tautology, only another tautology can be deduced, and no existential propositions such as God exists. So it's literally impossible to prove that God exists. More to the point, Ayer shows that God has no meaning in use. Which is to say, take a sentence in which the word God is used and try and translate it into a sentence in which it's not. And you'll find it's almost impossible. Which is to say, whenever you talk about God, there's either one of two things you should be talking about. Everything. Or nothing. Right? Either God is everything that is, or if it's a particular thing that you're pointing to and naming, I haven't seen it. And if you have, you'll probably get locked up. Therefore, we can say that God is literally, if it refers to everything, then it might as well refer to nothing. right? Because if you can't distinguish one thing from another, it's like the term being. Absolutely useless, has no synthetic or analytic value. So therefore, God is not a name. It's an indefinite description. It's not even a description. It's just a sound we use to sort of give us a sort of comfort. Thus, talk of God says nothing at all. It says nothing about the world, it says nothing about the structure of our language, and is therefore neither true or false, but just literal nonsense. Now, Ayer finishes his text with a final chapter entitled The Self and the Common World. And here, Ayer tries to establish something called radical reductionism, which is an attempt to take all of our sentences about physical objects and to translate them into sentences about sense contents. And the goal is quite clearly to show how all of our talk of the world is a purely logical construct of our phenomenal experience, our sensual experience. And we've seen this before with Berkeley. And it's through a sort of Berkeleyan phenomenalism, Ayer shows that the various entities of our world, both mental and physical, are logically constructed from sense contents, which are in turn just particular parts of experience. Such construction, by the way, is not a psychological fact, but rather it's a syntactical fact that object sentences that refer to physical phenomena can be translated into sense content sentences. So, a sentence about this lectern could be translated into sentences about the various colors that irradiate my optic nerve, various tactile sensations from rubbing against parts of it, the various sounds produced from rapping on it, and if I chose olfactory and tongue inspection, I could do so, but I'll pass on that. In any case, that's what our knowledge of this podium or lectern would turn out to be. Note that all of those sense contents are prior to objects, and therefore mind and body are in fact analytically posterior to those sense contents. Therefore, mind and body are both built up out of such sense contents. And the point is that mind and body is the mind-body issue that Descartes raised is a philosophic pseudo-problem. It may be a real problem for neurology, right? Neurologists may be able to get a handle on it or a purchase on it, or be able to argue that mind is a problem that can be turned into just neural structure, or maybe can't. Maybe it's epiphenomenal to it. But for the philosopher, it's no problem at all. We know how sentences of mind arise. They're built out of sense datum, just as sentences of physical objects are. Like physical objects, then he takes this Berkeleyan phenomenological radical reductionism and not only points externally, but internally as well. Let us then take the notion of the self. The self is, if we were confused by grammar, we think it is a substance, because we can use the word I in a sentence, therefore there must be something which thinks, the I. But in fact, like physical objects, the self is a logical construction out of sense experience. Specifically, presumably, the organic sense contents of the same body. Self-consciousness or awareness is not some metaphysical property, but it's rather the ability to remember earlier states of the same body. And with Hume, we reject any metaphysical posit of a substantive ego or a personality that suffuses and is behind ourself. And I think this is a very important breakthrough because there are several examples in which such a posit of self doesn't quite work, right? Take multiple personalities. Which is the real self in a person who has multiple personalities? That's a metaphysical problem, isn't it? It's a pseudo-problem. Whichever one the psychiatrist chooses to keep alive, and when he kills off the others, or she kills off the others, that's the one that'll have turned out to be the true self. And you can date the time when they're born, or people with multiple personalities claim they can. Similarly, we'll find among certain primitive peoples that when you go through a coming-of-age ritual, right, you're given a new name, and you go through some sort of, usually a horrific trial. Among the Australasians, it's usually sub-incision and circumcision with a stone hammer. It's a very nasty piece of business. But the point is, when you're done, you're not a boy anymore. You're a man, right? They do this horrible ritual, stick you and tell you to look into a fire for 5 days until you have some really weird experiences, and next time we go hunting boar with a stick, you won't run away and home to mama. You'll be ready to poke that thing with the stick. In that case, you give the person a new name. It's a new person. It's a new self, right? Our self is just that. It's a posit. And it's a useful posit because it's useful for legal purposes. Steal my car this week, I catch you next week, I can still prosecute you for it, right? And that's literally where the idea of personhood or self comes from. It's a useful notion. I can hold you responsible for actions you've done previously. And although your physical structure may have changed, I can still get my legal satisfaction from you. Now, one of the problems with this view, a constructive view of the self, is the problem of solipsism. Since you're only aware of your own self, your own sense contents, right? The quote, show between your ears, that phrase that we've belabored to death, it is entirely possible that you're the only one out there, right? That's called solipsism. Ayer's point is that you do not refute solipsism on logical grounds. You reject it on pragmatic grounds, just as Hume did. Since solipsism is in fact a synthetic or factual doctrine. It is a factual claim when someone says, I am the only person there. And if you refute it, it'll be because your eyes are irradiated by the light that presumably seems to look like other people. They make sounds that are not that dissimilar to your own, and they seem to eat the same sorts of foods you do. That's good factual grounds for believing there's a lot of people around you. So it's not a philosophic problem at all. Well, I want to conclude then with the role that Ayer sees for philosophy. He mentions this at the very end of this very powerful text. He says, the philosopher works as the handmaiden for the scientist. The scientist builds physical theories. The philosopher clarifies the concepts, shows him how he's using the logic of his terms, right? How he's using the various syntactic and semantic rules that describe science. If science may be said to be blind without philosophy, it is true also that philosophy is virtually empty without science. For while the analysis of our everyday language is useful as a means of preventing or exposing a certain amount of metaphysics, the problem which it presents are not of such difficulty or complexity as to make it probable that they will remain long unsolved. It is indeed misleading to draw a sharp distinction, as we have been doing, between philosophy and science. What we should rather do is distinguish between the speculative and the logical aspects of a science, and assert that philosophy must develop into the logic of science. With that passage, which almost concludes the text, we've gone a long way. Modern philosophy, just before Descartes, is born when Aquinas gives it a charter. When he first rediscovers the classic Aristotle and says, there is a separate role of reason, and that is to build philosophy, which is the handmaid of the queen of sciences, theology. Right? That was the original conception of philosophy, the handmaid of theology in Europe. We've gone a long way when you get to Ayer, when he says, no, philosophy is the handmaid of science. That is the future. If philosophy is to remain a respectable discipline in a century of Einstein, of Heisenberg, of Fermi, then certainly philosophy will have to become to a large degree the philosophy of science. And it is with that project that logical positivism dealt then for the next 30 or 40 years. And it is, I would urge, very much the project of contemporary philosophy to deal with that self-image, to critique it, comprehend it, perhaps extend it.